if we create a predictive model of AI, could that essentially be self-aware?
AI is on a path to being not only intelligent, but also conscious.
Does the brain produce consciousness? Is it the other way around?
We don't experience the world as it is. We experience an interpretation of the world.
Why were we created in this planet called Earth?
Evolution does a very, very good job of explaining how complex creatures like us and other animals can come about.
When we talk about consciousness states changing, what does that exactly mean?
You can basically take people down to a state where there's almost no activity at all. The brain is almost flatlining, and then still bring them back.
What is your view on life after death?
I find very unlikely that consciousness continues or comes back after death. Meditation is an altered state of consciousness, and your brain is in a different state. There will be a different aspect to the neural activity in the brain.
Before we start this podcast, I just want to make one humble request. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to this channel and press the notifications bell icon. This really helps us bring more guests to the show and have the platform to spread wisdom. Thank you and enjoy the podcast.
Anil, I'm so excited to have you on our podcast Under the Tree today. Your work has completely reshaped the way we think about consciousness. So thank you for being here today.
Oh, that's very kind of you to say, but I'm regardless of whether that's true, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So now, a topic that's getting very popular. There are so many individuals in the field of science who believe that artificial intelligence will one day achieve consciousness or become sentient. Do you think that's possible, first of all, or is consciousness inherently biological? And also, you mentioned in one of your recent conversations with Neil Tyson that you stated something along the lines of that consciousness is the only refuge for human exceptionalism. And obviously, AI becoming conscious would definitely pose a challenge to that. So let's start off by talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder what exactly I said to Neil in that show. I mean, I think many of us recognize, of course, that consciousness is not the preserve only of humans, that many other species are conscious too. But maybe the particular way in which humans are conscious, we still regard as something a little bit special. And, I think I really meant it in the sense that if we think about the history of science in the long view, it's been this sort of progressive dethronement of humanity from the center of things. We're no longer at the center of the universe, and then we're related to all other living creatures when Darwin comes along, and now consciousness is still this thing which we think, okay, there's still some refuge of mystery there where we can think of ourselves perhaps now along with other animals as super special and not woven into the tapestry of the rest of the universe. But of course, why would we want to do that when we understand how things actually are? I think the sense of awe and wonder increases. The universe that we live in is so much more impressive than just a sort of really reductive solar system. And evolution, the deep history of life, is much more interesting than thinking of us as just created out of nothing. And so I think understanding consciousness as part of the tapestry of universe is a really motivating thing to try for. Then if AI were to be conscious, I think really that's almost going at another of our sort of psychological hang-ups, which is the desire to play God sometimes. We always want to create technologies in our own image, and the idea of creating not only living creatures but conscious creatures has been ever present in cultural histories from many different cultural perspectives. Frankenstein's all about that, actually, but then there's Golem in Jewish folklore and culture was all about creating a conscious creature out of clay. So this idea has always been there, and I think part of the quite deeply held belief by a lot of people that AI is on a path to being not only intelligent but also conscious. Part of that can be traced to these psychological biases that we have. That at least some of us have this desire to play God, and we also tend to project qualities into things on the basis of similarities. So we tend to bundle consciousness and intelligence together, which will lead us to think that if something is intelligent, then consciousness is going to come along for the ride. And I just think that's really not a very sensible point of view. It speaks to our anthropocentrism, our anthropomorphism, our human exceptionalism, our psychological biases, rather than being an insight into what's likely to happen. So just stripping away those immediately for me makes it less likely that consciousness is just going to come along as AI gets smarter. But there's a deeper reason I'm skeptical too, which is there's a very fundamental assumption underlying most claims about AI and consciousness, which is that consciousness is a form of computation. That if you get the right kinds of computations, doesn't matter what they're being implemented by, could be by a brain, could be by a computer, then you'll get consciousness. And this is an assumption in philosophy called computational functionalism, that computations are sufficient for consciousness. And I just think it might be true, but it's a very, very, very big assumption to make, and it hasn't really been sufficiently examined. And I think there are actually some good reasons why it might not be true. So I'm actually pretty skeptical of AI being conscious.
Yeah, I think I know Sam Altman was asked this in a recent interview as well, where do you think that ChatGPT, like the newest version, right, could become conscious? And I don't know. I think he said something along the lines is that he's not exactly sure, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot. That, like, for example, if we create a predictive model of AI, then could that essentially be self-aware, right? Which would, allow us to call it conscious. But yeah, the points that you said, I think, to be honest, at the stage we're in right now in terms of discovery, there's not much hope that AI will become conscious. But in principle, some people say that it can. I guess when we're talking about on this line only, do you personally think that we will ever be able to upload our consciousness into a digital format, or is that just science fiction? There has been some theories about this, but I would love to get your take on it.
Yeah, I think it's that relies on the same fundamental assumption, right? So you could say, right, if I simulated your brain in absolute detail, down to every last molecule, but it's a computer simulation, right? Much as I can have a computer simulation of a weather system or something, then maybe that will will give rise to a conscious experience of being you, that you can you can upload. That would be what uploading means. You just basically run a computer simulation of your brain somewhere in the cloud, and you live forever in some kind of silicon rapture. But this relies on exactly the same assumption, that computation is sufficient for consciousness. And if it isn't, then you'll no more upload your consciousness to the cloud than when you simulate a rainstorm, you actually get wet. It will just only ever be a model, a simulation of your brain, not the thing itself. I think, you can't. There's no certainty is not available here. There's no knockdown proof or disproof either way. But for me, the balance of evidence is that no, consciousness is not a matter of computation, at least not the kinds of computers that we have, that do implement things called Turing machines as a very specific form of computation. It's probably not that. So I would certainly not take the gamble of uploading myself to the cloud and thinking I would live forever or be forever, because I wouldn't be alive. I'd just be simulated. No, that would just be a simulation of me.
You were mentioning this earlier about the whole simulation thing. So let's talk a little bit about Donald Hoffman's work. I think you have done a conversation with him as well, if I'm not mistaken. What are your insights on that, like that whole aspect of the conscious agents theory and the virtual simulation that's going on in life?
So yeah, Donald and I, we've had a number of very insightful conversations. I've learned a lot from speaking to him, but I don't agree with him, at least as far as I think I understand him. after a certain point. Now, I think we agree up to a point, and then we start to diverge. The points where we agree up to are these ideas of perceptual experience being a kind of controlled hallucination or a construction. That we don't experience the world as it is, we experience an interpretation of the world. And that goes very deep. It might involve things like our experience of time and space, and especially, this is where a lot of my interest is, in the self. So the self is something that the brain is constructing. It's part of our perception, not the thing that does the perceiving. So I'm totally on board with that. In fact, that's describes a lot of what I've been doing over the last many years. But then I think, and I don't want to say too much because I'll be at risk of misstating Donald's beliefs. And but when he starts to talk about conscious agents, I think he's making other claims about the fundamental nature of what consciousness is and how it fits into the the fundamental nature of the universe as well, the ontology of the universe. And these conscious agents have a sort of fundamental quality that they exist and everything else is built from them. I'm not persuaded by this. He might be right. I mean, when we're talking about things at that level of metaphysics, his claims about the fundamental nature of reality, then it's very hard to know how to distinguish these different beliefs. But I don't think they're warranted by the experimental data that we have in cognitive neuroscience. Here, I think we're limited to say certain things about brains, minds, and experience, roughly in the realm that we know.
Just before kind of going forward, I just would love if you can provide maybe a little bit clarity about what your thoughts are on the connection of the brain and the consciousness, just so I want to be clear, like what your take on that is. Like, I guess in the sense that, I think I know, you know what I mean? Like, does the brain produce consciousness? Is it the other way around? Do they have some type of other relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think I remain a little bit agnostic, I have to say. I think these are all, does the brain produce consciousness? Is matter is matter secondary to consciousness, or is consciousness a product of matter? These are all positions that experiments won't distinguish between. However, I describe myself as a pragmatic materialist, that I think it's most useful to take the view that consciousness is something, there's a property of matter organized somehow, and that matter is in this sense primary, comes ontologically before consciousness. So does that mean consciousness is something the brain produces, or is it just something the brain does, or is it that it's sort of a different aspect of some more fundamental thing? Here I'm a bit agnostic. I tend to always equivocate between saying this kind of brain activity gives rise to consciousness, or is a conscious experience, is sort of identical to a conscious experience. But that doesn't really matter. I think the fundamental thing is, I think it's more likely, certainly I think it's more useful to take the view that consciousness is something that brains do or give rise to, and not the other way around.
So, I mean, you've probably had people ask you this. Definitely, these are conversations I have with people as well, that, okay, if consciousness is something that's in a way special to humans, right, it's what makes us exceptional in a way. I guess, what would your layman explanation to that be? Like, so what? Okay, we are conscious. How does that matter in the realm of material world and this life that we have?
Well, I mean, it's central, isn't it? I mean, consciousness is what gives our lives meaning. If you've had general anesthesia, then there is nothing going on for you. There is no experience whatsoever. It's the ability to have conscious experiences that is absolutely central to life. Without consciousness, really nothing else matters to us. And then in a very pragmatic sense too, many forms of suffering manifest in conscious experiences. Otherwise, we wouldn't call them suffering. But if we want to understand mental health problems, psychiatric problems, then we need to understand the nature of how particular conscious experiences come about in the brain. And if we want to live better lives, then we might want to cultivate particular states of consciousness and not others. Meditation is all about this, but other things too. Even in daily life, we can try to bring about certain states of consciousness. And then finally, I think there's a lot to be gained in recognizing that our conscious experiences can be different from one person to another. And this is underappreciated because our conscious experiences seem to reveal the world exactly as it is, not in a way that doesn't seem dependent on our own minds and brains. But we know that's not true. We know that our conscious experiences are dependent on our own minds and brains as well as on what's out there in the world and the body. And I think cultivating a little bit of humility about our own perceptual take on the world is important more today than ever before in this world of increasing polarization and fractionation.
Yeah, I loved your answer to that. I just wanted to definitely get your take on it because you're a neuroscientist, and coming from you, it just kind of puts that validation to it, because I actually graduated in consciousness studies. I was a major, and my whole hope was so yeah, and I was going to go into medical science. I'm still now starting to pursue a psychology degree, but kind of for the same motive that you mentioned, that I feel like there's a lot to do with human suffering and pain that we could help out with if we get a better understanding of the nature of consciousness. You mentioned states of consciousness, so I have a few follow-ups on that. I guess the first would be, what is it that defines I think what I'm getting to here is that a difference between consciousness and one's opinion or perception. So, for example, if both of us have a sip of coffee, I might think it's too sweet, you might think it's bitter, right? It's the same exact coffee, but we are perceiving it two completely different ways. So, does that have to do with consciousness, brain, something else? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think all of them, right? I think it's a good example. So, yeah, and people do disagree about the taste of coffee, right? This is one of those cases where people can have, if you like, the same object, taste the same stuff, and have a different experience in a way that's much less controversial than, let's say, looking at the same, I don't know, like the color of a car across the road and saying, well, I know I see it as blue, you see it as green. Of course, there was an example years ago about this photo of a dress that half the world saw as blue and black and the other half saw as white and gold. So there are occasions where people can have very different color experiences. But taste is probably we're more comfortable with individual differences there. And it's not so surprising, is it? I mean, we all differ on the outside in terms of, our height, our skin color, our body shape, and so on. And we all have different brains too, slightly, maybe not dramatically, but slightly. So it's not really surprising that we will have different experiences even for the same shared objective reality. And so, yeah, it's a property of the brain. It's a property of perception because the taste of something is a perceptual process. It's interpreting some sensory signal. And in most cases, it's also a conscious perceptual experience. We have the actual experiential sweetness or tanginess or head rush or bitterness or whatever else it might be that this coffee tastes like. So yeah, it's all of the above, and they can all be different for each of us.
That's interesting. Being a neuroscientist, has a question ever come to you, Anil, that okay, like we're humans, right? We're conscious, that's wonderful, and we're born with a brain and certain other features. And I mean, this could be your opinion, like, do you believe in the Big Bang or anything? But like, why were we created in this planet called Earth? Who's the person or some type of energy that made our brain and made us feel that way? I would love to get your take on that. Whatever.
Oh, I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but I don't think there's a who. I don't know what the right answer is, but I think the wrong answer is looking for a who decided to make all of this stuff. And I think evolution does a very, very good job of explaining how complex creatures like us and other animals can come
Mhm.
about, given, energy of the right kind, a sort of environment of the right kind, and lots and lots and lots of time. I mean, we don't. It's so hard to grasp the nature of deep time and how long evolution has been going on, in comparison to our puny human timescales. Um, as to why there's a universe in the first place, I'm sorry, I pass. I have no idea.
This is one of those existential questions that I've been thinking about personally. Okay, let's talk about so yeah, you were mentioning anesthesia. So I actually had a operation. I was like 11, but I went under general anesthesia, and I 100% remember that I did not remember anything. So it was like there was no time, no space in a way what Donald Hoffman would say.
Mm.
What happens during that point? Because you would be knowing more about the context of anesthesia and like so like what happened to me, right? I didn't feel
Let's
the pain. I came back
no.
like what it was.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? It's for those people who've had it, like you and me, it's totally different. It's immediately obvious how different it is from sleep. And how if the anesthesiologist tells you before, you'll just go to sleep for a bit and then you'll wake up, and that they're telling you, a nice like white lie, because it's being asleep is sort of familiar, and it makes everything a little less scary. But anesthesia is nothing like sleep, at least when it's deep enough, and which is why it feels so different. In fact, it's why it feels like nothing at all. There is not, and it's not that it feels like nothing. There is no feeling, right? There is no experience going on. It's not the absence of experience. It's not the experience of absence. It is the absence of all experience. So it's a good way of defining consciousness, actually. Consciousness is the opposite of deep general anesthesia. It's any kind of experience whatsoever. Um, and it's not really a surprise then when you look inside the brain, you also see that the state of deep anesthesia is very different from any state of sleep. And, in the deepest states of anesthesia, and I don't know, it's very hard to know, how, I don't know how deep you went, don't know without brain imaging. Um, but you can basically take people down to a state where there's almost no activity at all. The brain is almost flatlining, and then still bring them back. So that's very, very different state to be in. That state, you are an object, and then later on you become a person again.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I never really thought about that. And then as I'm kind of getting more into these subjects, it's something that really fascinated me. But is there a really significant difference between going under anesthesia and then when you're in deep sleep? Because even something like deep sleep, I don't know, like whatever the time period is, it doesn't feel like anything, right? There's a sense of blankness. And when you wake up, you kind of intuitively know that there was a time where there was nothing, not even dreaming. So what is the difference between those two states?
I think there can be a little bit of overlap between some anesthetic states and some very deep sleep states. Um, but I wouldn't want to overstate those similarities because I think the differences are just more interesting and important. When you are asleep, yeah, sure, you in very deep sleep, experience can seem to go away. But in fact, there's a lot of experiments now that if you wake people up, so in most nights of sleep, some parts of it are in what are called slow wave sleep. So slow wave sleep because in the brain activity is going in these big slow waves, which is related to, or the reason it looks like that is because neurons in your brain periodically shut off. So it's as if the patterns of communication start up and then they're all interrupted. And then they start up again and they're all interrupted again. That slow wave sleep, typically people don't have rich dreams in this state. But if you wake them up, often they'll still report that something was going on in their minds. Maybe it's something really simple, but something. And then REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, is when most dreams happen. In anesthesia, you can have elements of this slow wave stuff, but you can also take the brain into states that you never see even in deep sleep. And I think this is relevant because even in deep sleep, you might sleep for a bit and then wake up and you have some sense of how much time has passed. But under anesthesia, you really don't.
What about the connection between consciousness and memory? So let's take a case of, a grandmother who's has dementia, right? There's not much memory there, but she's still technically conscious. So, and memory, I guess it's really related to the mind, the brain. So, what's the connection then between memory and consciousness? Do you need, can someone have consciousness without basically any memory, or is memory really essential to self-awareness?
I mean, there's more than one type of memory, I think is part of the issue here. Um, there's the memory we might talk about in everyday language, like do you remember what you did yesterday or where you went on holiday last year? Or do you remember where you are or who's the president or who's the prime minister or something like that. Um, but there's other forms of memory. Like if you close your eyes right now, there's a sort of visual memory of what I just saw that lasts maybe a second, 2, 3 seconds. So there's all kinds of memory. And so it's very difficult to ask or answer, even harder to answer, uh, does consciousness depend, or could you be conscious without any form of memory at all? Because very generally, memory is any kind of sort of persistent activity over time. So I think that just doesn't really make sense. When we talk about the more familiar form of memory, like remembering what you did yesterday, that form of memory seems very, very key to a particular aspect of self-awareness, right? The experience of being an individual with a particular identity. That's where these kinds of memories seem pretty critical. But it's not clear they're actually necessary. There are some examples. So dementia is one case, right? But then it's a bit hard because so many things are changing in dementia usually. But there's another condition, it's very rare, of people that have maybe after an infection or some brain injury, they have very specific amnesia and they can't lay down any new memories, episodic, autobiographical memories of this kind. So they don't know what they did yesterday. They don't know what's going on. They only live in a present moment of about maybe a few minutes or half an hour. These people are still very clearly conscious. And they also have a sense of self. They have emotions. They're fully present in their bodies and so on. But they have an altered sense of the individual person that they are at that kind of higher level storytelling way. The self being a story the brain tells itself. So that can go. But in general, memory and consciousness are sort of bound together very tightly at all sorts of different timescales and levels.
Well, you were saying this. I just remembered a couple days ago we hosted a guest in our studio. He's believes in stoicism, but he's also a biologist. And he was talking about this case. I don't know if you've heard of it, but apparently it was really famous where there was a man who's a really, he was a perfect man. He had a family, ethical, everything. And then suddenly he started visiting like illegal websites and he was like about to go to jail for it, right? And that doctor who was in that case realized that he had a brain tumor that was affecting him to then do these unethical things, right? So then he was acquitted. A few years later, and he was perfectly normal, everything was fine. A few years later, again, he got the urge to go on these illegal websites again, and he realized that that brain tumor, which had been taken out, was back again. So what was interesting about this case, the reason I wanted to bring it up was because it showed that he had a sense of self-awareness, right? That he was aware of the fact that he was about to do something and that he had that memory that it was probably because of the tumor coming back in. What are your thoughts on that, I guess, in relation to your consciousness theory as well?
Yeah, I mean it's a fascinating case. I think I know the one you mean. I've read about it too, and there are other cases like that where people have made the case that something they did wasn't their fault. It was because of something happened to their brain. And this gets into really tricky and interesting territory about when we hold people responsible for their actions. And intuitively it seems reasonable, right? I mean, this guy didn't choose to have a brain tumor. It wasn't his fault that he got a brain tumor. And if that brain tumor changed his behavior in a particular way, then he shouldn't, whatever he means, shouldn't be held responsible for that. Uh, the very famous case about this was called the Texas Tower Sniper, I think, in the 60s. And a guy, an engineering student who basically shot a bunch of people on a university campus. And he left a note saying, he was killed by the police, and he left a note saying he hadn't been feeling right. And in the autopsy, big brain tumor, like adjacent to his amygdala, which is part of the brain that deals a lot with emotion and fear and anxiety and so on. So again, you're inclined to think, well, tragic set of circumstances, but this person's behavior can be explained by the fact that he had a tumor. He wouldn't have done it, the logic being he wouldn't have done it if he didn't have the tumor. And that changes the whole narrative of the case. I think the difficulty comes in that the more we understand about the brain basis of behavior, then the more gray area opens up here. Like, what about someone who, for instance, had a deprived childhood, and so, maybe malnutrition, their brain didn't develop in a way it would have done had they, been eating kale and organic kale every day. And then they go on to commit some crime. Now, are they responsible, or which logic do we apply? It's not their fault that they have the brain that they have, but they have the brain that they have. So who's responsible? Is anyone responsible? Ultimately, you get some people arguing that no one should be held responsible for anything. I think that's, for me personally, I don't feel that's a workable solution to this. But it's one of those things where I think we've just got to admit the complexities of these situations, and how also that science is not going to have the answer to everything. Science in this case is just going to make things a bit more complicated. But ultimately, it's a decision that has to be made. We collectively, or ideally, maybe we collectively agree as a society how we make these kinds of decisions in these grey areas. One option is that if a person has a certain degree of cognitive competence, well, then they're responsible, even if, there are other things that might be mitigating factors.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of, I think, ethical implications that come into the play when we talk about these things. So I guess in relation to the last couple minutes of what we were talking about, so do you agree, right, that significant rewiring of the brain can fundamentally change one's subjective experience of reality then?
Yeah, sure. You
Right?
change the brain, I think your experience will change.
Very interesting. Um, so I guess my next question is that um, where do we draw the line between unconscious and conscious states, in the way that does consciousness always exist, right? It's never ending, because you mentioned that whole idea of the states of consciousness. So when we talk about consciousness states changing, what does that exactly mean? Is that like, oh, we're getting old? Like, for example, right? When someone gets older, they naturally get more mature, right? Because they learn from their experiences, they go to school, whatever. Is consciousness like that, where in a way it's getting better or mature, or what's your take on that?
I mean, it changes through the lifetime, I think. I mean, you mentioned dementia a bit earlier, so it's not unidirectional, right? I think there is a real sense in which, for many people, towards the end of life, there's a loss of the richness of conscious experience, whether that's in memory or in other aspects. Um, it changes. Um, so there's both there's continuity, but there's also significant change in the way consciousness is manifest at different stages in life, for sure.
I saw, I mean, I would like to actually ask you this because it's something that I like asking scientists, especially, is what is your view on life after death? And just to clarify my question, I'm not saying that the person dies and then they're going to come back. So I'm not really talking about reincarnation in that sense, but more of in the sense that, let's say I die, right? Whatever year that is my consciousness then completely going to die, or is there any way that that could then come back in any form from a scientific perspective?
I mean, no one knows for 100% sure, right? I think there always has to be a bit of a caveat here, a bit of humility. Um, Having said that, I find it very unlikely that consciousness continues or comes back after death. It does depend on what you mean, though, right? I mean, you said yourself that it's not like you'll come back as you. I think that's sort of off the table. In fact, not many religious traditions would sign up for that either. It's not that you come back as you. That seems entirely implausible because even while you're alive, what it is to be you is always changing anyway. So what do we mean by coming back then? I mean that question becomes a little strange because consciousness itself is still there while there are other conscious organisms. Like the moment you die, another individual might be born. And so there's a continuation of consciousness there, but it's somehow maybe not what people are meaning. But what else could they mean? Because if you're not talking about the continuity of the self, so long as consciousness continues and there will be, as part of this continuation of consciousness in general, there'll be always new self experiences happening. Maybe that's enough.
Right, yeah. I think even I mean religions have a different way to look at this. With the concept of reincarnation, I don't believe in the fact that like we're reborn in the sense that I'm going to be born in this exact same face, height, shape, name, whatever that is. But yeah, the idea that consciousness lives on might be true in that sense. You were mentioning, right, like if someone dies, another living being might be born. But that is a ongoing debate, and yeah, it's always really nice to get a view from a science perspective. You talked a little bit about meditation in the previous podcast, but can you talk a little bit more about what happens to the brain and consciousness during deep meditation? And the reason I'm asking this is because last year I went on a really advanced retreat, a meditation retreat, and I'm a very big skeptic when it comes to these things. But I'm not going to lie, I was able to levitate, and there were a lot of people who were able to levitate in that room based on that specific meditation technique. I'm not going to say it just for, other confidential purposes, but what happens during that process?
Well, that's extraordinary. I've never seen that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how that would happen. I have no explanation for that. Um, but yeah, meditation. Yes, I mean, there's been plenty of studies. I mean, it's a little out of my wheelhouse, but meditation is an altered state of consciousness. Your brain is in a different state. There will be a different aspect to the neural activity in the brain in deep states of meditation. About just over a week ago, I was in India and I was talking to Mathieu Ricard, who's a monk and originally a molecular biologist in France, but for decades has been living in monasteries in Nepal. And I think he's probably the person who's very experienced meditation practitioner and his brain has been scanned so many times. So I think he sort of hits this overlap of where meditation and neuroscience meet. So I don't know exactly what all the differences are, but you see changes in brain rhythms. I think you can see it in people who engage in long-term meditative practice. There's even some evidence, I don't know how reliable it is, that you see long-term changes in the brain. I mean, one way I like to think about at least some meditative practices is that they're really about training attention. We learn to pay attention to the flow of thoughts, the flow of experiences. So it wouldn't surprise me that some of the things that you see in the brain are related to the processes of how we pay attention to things.
Yeah. And yeah, I know that you were in India. We were conversing over email. I How was that experience? I don't know have if you ever did you go end up going to the Makum? I know that was taking place there as well. How was that?
I did, yeah, yeah. So my dad's side of the family come from a city used to be called Allahabad. It's now called Prayagraj. The Prime Minister Modi has changed the names of some of the cities, but this is a city. A lot of my family still live there. It's a city where every year there's a big religious festival on the banks of the river Ganges, where the Ganges and the Yamuna meet. But every 12 years, it's an enormous festival. I mean, in India, you always have to add on a zero anyway. But I mean, this gets super crazy. Um, it lasts 45 days. And in Hinduism, it's if you can bathe in the Ganges during this festival, and especially on one of the three main bathing days called Snans, this is an incredibly auspicious thing to do. I've actually been twice before. And I did make it this time as well. I was in there in 2001 and in 2013, and now again in 2025, so every 12 years. And it's an extraordinary experience. The day I was there, I think there were probably 10 to 15 million people um, bathing in the river or walking to the river and back on that day. It's a very large number of people. And I went initially by motorbike and then after a while just by walking because you couldn't get further. And you just become part of this river of people walking to the river. And I did notice that, in a sense, my sense of being a distinct individual was substantially attenuated because you were just you had less opportunity for doing things. I had to go where the river of people was going. They were all going with the same purpose. All quite, it was pretty calm. It was not very, it was fine. Um, and yeah, you feel less of a separate person from everybody else, and that was super super interesting.
That's amazing. You're honestly very blessed to have gone there. So, I mean, our family is also Hindu and Indian, so we
Mm.
go to India a lot, but we weren't able to make it to the Makum. We did have a devotee who from Swami Sivapremananda's actually center who went there and was able to get us a little bit of the water from the
Oh,
snan.
you got some Ganga Jal then.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, from that specific day, the really auspicious day, so that was really powerful.
The 29th. So I think the
Yes.
29th of January so that's the day I've been on the two previous Mahakums. I wasn't there on the 29th this time. To be honest, I was quite glad because the numbers this time were way too much, and there was some problems. There were some crowd crushes on the 29th this year.
Yeah, and when you were talking about the sense of self, it's I think that's really important. I actually spent I was born and brought up in New York, but I ended up spending almost 7 years in India during the COVID time and a few years after, and that was kind of where I actually got interested in consciousness studies because of more towards spirituality, but it also led to the science of consciousness, which I think are for me they're very similar and connected, to be honest. You were talking about the sense of self and how you felt kind of a less of separation. I feel like that's very important because through this podcast, we really try to spread this message of oneness through whatever means that is, not anything to do with religion, just that entire aspect of not trying to be too much into your egoistic self, thinking that you're special, and then the entire world revolves around you, because that aspect of oneness is really what brings a sense of peace and calm. I feel like a lot of times we're conditioned to kind of feel that, there is a distinct between you and the other person, depending on your status, money, whatever that is. And I feel like thinking that there is that oneness in terms of we are all conscious, right, on this planet, really helps kind of bring your false ego a little bit less. It helped me to get a lot of peace and calm in your mind. So it was really nice that you just brought that up.
And that's good. So where were you in India? Which part of India were you living in?
New Delhi. So our grandparents, like they were born and brought up there, and then our parents were the immigrant family who came here. But it was we were able to go throughout my time there. I went to like Rishikesh and a lot of those holy places. where you get these vibrations. And it was when I decided to choose my major. It was, of course, consciousness studies, but essentially most of the curriculum that I had to do with was the science of consciousness. And it was that's what got me motivated to do this podcast. I guess I want to ask you, have you ever because I know your family comes from like an Indian background, some of your family, but
Hmm.
have you ever like heard the word of Vedanta or like any of those texts while growing up or anything like that? Or maybe
I mean,
recently?
not when I was growing up, to be actually, I grew up in a small village in Oxfordshire, and my dad had left India in the actually probably the late 1940s, and he decided, I think, that he wanted to. I mean, my mother's English, and so they together decided that they kind of wanted to live an English life, really. So I didn't grow up in an Indian community in the UK, just in a small village. And I only started, I went to India when I was young. When I was 6, they took me there's a ceremony called the Mundan for as you know.
Yes, yes.
Um, and then I didn't go again until I was 18. So it wasn't part of my growing up really at all. And I've become, progressively much more interested, fascinated by that part of the world and by that part of my family and the traditions and the Vedanta and the scriptures. And so I don't know as much about it as I should. I feel always bad about that. I'm trying to learn Hindi as well now, which is going very slowly. But I'm motivated.
It's such a pleasure to be talking to you, Anil, and thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for doing this. And your work and book is amazing. I'm so glad that there are more people like you out there who are actually pursuing research in this and making such fascinating discoveries. It was such an honor having you here.
Oh, that's super kind. I've really enjoyed talking to both of you, and it's been a delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.